d'être venu ce matin pour cette présentation et discussion du livre de Joël. Il y a 3 jours, Marilia Eisenstein est morte. Marilia Eisenstein était quelqu'un qui nous était extrêmement cher. Marilia avait accueilli plusieurs fois les événements pour Ithaque et nous avait soutenus. Nous allons publier une série de textes classiques de l'école psychosomatique de Paris, où elle a été non seulement un auteur, mais une cheville ouvrière. C'est une très grande perte pour nous, voilà. Et je voulais que cette matinée, en quelque sorte, on ait une pensée pour Marilia, qui, comme vous savez, est décédée d'une longue maladie, qui a vraiment montré jusqu'au bout une sorte de qualité humaine, de pudeur, de dignité, de force extrêmement inspirante, je trouve, parce qu'elle le liait explicitement à sa pratique et son expérience de la psychanalyse. Voilà. Donc nous accueillons ce matin Joel Whitebook. Joel Whitebook a fait une double carrière de philosophe et de psychanalyste à New York. Et il est ici pour nous présenter et nous parler de son travail. Il ne va pas faire un exposé sur son livre, mais il va nous présenter des sources, ses recherches. Et son exposé donc va s'appeler ce matin Freud, Fils et la sublimation, et qui est un peu un travail plus précis et un prolongement du travail qu'il a présenté jusqu'ici. Donc je dirais, il va commencer, puis je ferai une réponse à son texte, en discutant un peu des positions à la fois surtout psychanalytiques que Joël a adoptées. Et puis, comme promis, donc vous avez les traductions du texte de Joël. Moi, je ferai mon exposé en français. Il a un handout avec l'anglais, okay. Et nous prendrons un petit temps pour échanger. Et vous pourrez poser vos questions en français. Je ferai la traduction simultanée. Donc, quand vous posez vos questions, vous parlez normalement, parce que je fais la traduction avec une phrase de décalage pour Joël, et je traduirai sa réponse. Des questions pour l'amour du ciel, courtes, pour que je puisse avoir le temps de traduire et que je puisse avoir des réponses aussi courtes de Joël. Nous ferons une pause dans laquelle voilà, pour prendre un café, pour rafraîchir. Il y a Yannick Lerible de la compagnie qui est venu avec des exemplaires à vendre. Il y a aussi donc des exemplaires des livres d'Ithaque qui sont en vente. Je vous invite à visiter son stand. Donc une annonce commerciale ce matin, les dédicaces. Il y a une promotion sur les dédicaces. Et je dédicace tous les livres. Il n'y a aucun problème, quel que soit l'auteur. Donc voilà, Yannick. Voilà. Et puis nous reprendrons et nous écouterons successivement donc Mathilde Girard, qui est philosophe de formation, qui est psychanalyste à l'APF et qui est cinéaste et qui nous communiquera quelque chose autour de sa perception, de sa réception personnelle, subjective du livre de Joël. Et puis nous écouterons Mathurin Schweyer, qui est philosophe et qui est membre donc de mon laboratoire, qui est le laboratoire qui a largement contribué à financer la traduction et la venue de Joël à Paris, le laboratoire de l'EHESS qui s'appelle le LIER-FIT. Voilà, j'ai pas pris trop de temps, j'espère que je n'ai oublié aucune chose technique. Et maintenant, voilà, Joël va nous donner une version abrégée, celle que vous avez. J'ai tout traduit du texte original. Là, vous avez, donc il va sauter des passages, mais vous aurez une idée plus générale de son texte. Here, Joel, it's up to you.
Okay. Before I begin with my paper, I would like to take the opportunity to express my deep gratitude to Pierre-Henri and his colleagues who put an enormous effort into translating this book and producing it and publishing it. I had totally given up on the hopes of my book ever being translated into French, and the fact that it's happened is enormously gratifying. Thank you. Is that good? Can you hear me? Before turning to my narrative, I would like to say something about the theoretical concerns that inform it. When I undertook my study of Freud's life and work, My goal was not only to write an intellectual biography, but also to write one with a theoretical intent. In addition to elucidating the relation between the development of Freud's thinking and what was taking place in his inner world, his personal life, and the society at large, I also set out to explore theoretical issues that were of interest to me, especially the question of sublimation. As Laplanche and Pontellier famously observed, the concept of sublimation answers a basic need in Freudian doctrine, and it is hard to see how it could be dispensed with. The problem is, however, that the field has yet to produce a satisfactory account of that essential concept. The notable contributions of Hans Lowald and Cornelius Castoriadis notwithstanding. Consequently, quote, the lack of a coherent theory of sublimation remains, as the authors of the language of psychoanalysis also observe, one of the lacunae in psychoanalytic theory. I am not so presumptuous as to suggest that I will remove that lacunae. I am only suggesting that my research constitutes an effort in that direction. Thus, my biography represents, among other things, a case study in which the subject is Sigmund Freud, and where I examine the process of sublimation as it can be observed in his life. At the time I began work on my project, the Freud bashers were still riding high, and I wanted to counter their pathologizing attempts to debunk his accomplishments. To counter them, my strategy was to stand them on their heads. Thus, where the bashers attempted to discredit Freud's achievements by reducing them to their lowly origins, as Nietzsche would say, I sought to demonstrate how he had produced those achievements by taking up that the lowly material of his instinctual unconscious life and transmuting it into cultural objects of the highest order. What is required to remove the lacuna in psychoanalytic theory, noted by Laplanche and Pontellier, is a theory which is both genetic and non-reductionist. That is the hard task confronting psychoanalytic theory. For only such a theory can acknowledge the lowly origins of our higher accomplishments without simultaneously reducing them to those origins. Indeed, such a theory as which Bernard Williams, English philosopher, refers to as a vindicatory as opposed to a deflationary genealogy, is needed to make those accomplishments intelligible. To do that, the theory must elucidate, this is the important goal. To do that, the theory must elucidate the developmental process in and through which genetic material undergoes a change of function and achieves a sufficient degree of freedom from that material so that it can claim a relative, not absolute, autonomy. One of the central aims of the anti-Freudians indictment, or one of the central items on the anti-Freudians indictment of Freud was his relationship to Fliess. They assumed that if they succeeded in exposing its scandalous aspects, which were abundant indeed, they would have discredited not only the man, but also his work, and perhaps even the profession that he had created. The reaction that Shirley Nelson Garner described when she read the uncensored edition of Freud's letters to Fliess for the first time was not uncommon. Quotes, what was most apparent and surprising to me, the feminist theorist wrote, was that these were love letters. Garner is right. Freud's letters to Fliess are a testament to his passionate, tempestuous, and prolonged love for his only other. Indeed, I would go further and say that with its nasal surgeries, cocaine use, numerological pseudoscience, homoerotic infatuation, ideals about male menstruation, quest for the perfect contraceptive device, pitched battles over Freud's beloved cigars, the almost fatal maltreatment of a female patient, grandiose flattery, and self-important scientific congresses, the relationship assumed a level of madness that authorizes us to describe it as an amour fou. As opposed to the anti-Freudians, who adduce the evidence of this madness to discredit Freud, I will do just the opposite. In addition to fully acknowledging its existence, I will also argue not only that the right kind of madness, which Plato referred to as divine madness or divine mania, which is sent from the gods, might be a necessary condition for all creativity of a significant magnitude. I will also argue that Freud's amour fou for fleas represented a felicitous form of madness, which was a necessary condition for the creation of psychoanalysis, its admittedly unsavory aspects notwithstanding. Henri Ellenberger's theory of creative illness can help me make my case. The eminent historian of psychiatry argues that Freud's turbulent and even chaotic entanglement with fleas can be understood as a case of that syndrome, which he notes is not only, quote, found among shamans and mystics of various religions, but also among certain philosophers and creative writers. Excuse me. According to Ellenberger, the disorder consists of, quotes, a polymorphous creative condition that can take the shape of depression, neurosis, and psychosomatic ailments. He observes, moreover, that the way that Freud's transference infatuation with fleas ended corresponds to the way creative illnesses often terminate. Along with being rapid and marked by a phase of exhilaration, the subject emerges from his ordeal with a permanent transformation in his personality and the conviction that he has discovered great truths of the spiritual world. My thesis, then, it is that Freud's amour fou for fleas constituted the lowly material out of which his epical sublimatory achievement, that is, the creation of psychoanalysis, emerged. If we assume that the discovery of psychic reality constituted Freud's great achievement, then it becomes clear that it was necessary for him to complete two interrelated steps before he could arrive at it, before he could discover psychic reality. The first step, which began during his tenure at Salpêtrière, consisted in moving from being a neuropsychologist to becoming a clinical psychologist, which is to say, abandoning a physicalist approach and adopting the psyche rather than the brain as the object of his research. Secondly, and concomitantly, he also had to move from diagnosing himself as a neurasthenic, suffering from an actual neurosis that was caused by current factors in his life, to acknowledging that he was a hysteric, like his patients. That is, a neurotic who suffered from a psychogenetic illness rooted in the past. It is my claim that he fulfilled these two requirements in and through his experience and struggle with fleas. Only after he had resolved the relationship in a good enough fashion, separated from the Berliner, and appropriated his own truly monumental capacities, could he complete the process and emerge as the first psychoanalyst. That's the end of the introduction. Part 2. Freud met the Berliner 1 year after he and Martha were finally married. And while the marriage put an end to the extreme agony resulted from the protracted engagement, it also put an end to the passionate stage of their relationship. This was so because one of the major causes of that agony, namely the long and painful separation, also coincided with an essential condition for the intense passion. The fact that the couple was separated for extended periods meant that the fantasy component, which is present in all states of being in love, was especially preponderant in Freud's case. Moreover, because of the separation, he was not forced to test his fantasies against the actually existing Martha, which meant that he could elaborate them with a relative lack of external constraint. Once the couple moved into their flat on Maria Theresienstadtstrasse, however, all that changed. Confronted with the realities of a partner who could not possibly measure up to his idealized image of her, as well as the demands of everyday life, the passion subsided. Moreover, as Louis Breger observes, although Freud had hoped that the marriage would free him from his inner turmoil, the inner turmoil he'd experienced during the seemingly interminable engagement, quote, his anxiety, depression, and physical complaints actually got worse after the marriage, leading him to look elsewhere for relief. And the charismatic otolaryngologist, ear, nose, and throat doctor from Berlin became the heir to the passionate stage of Freud's relation to Martha. Freud's relationship with Fliess started slowly and only began to take hold in earnest 6 years after their initial meeting in 1887, when Fliess became his physician, treating him during the so-called cardiac episode. The intensity of Freud's idealization hunger, however, can already be observed in the first letter he wrote to his new colleague after immediately meeting him. Despite barely knowing the man, Freud confesses, quote, "You have left a deep impression on me, which could easily lead me to tell you outright in what category of a man I place you," end of quote. As Freud himself has taught us, idealization, that is, the over-evaluation of the object, can seriously impair a person's critical faculties. And Freud's massive overvaluation of Freud helps to explain the question which has vexed so many commentators of how a homo rationalis like Freud, with his exceptional intelligence, could have behaved so credulously with regard to a person as dubious as Fliess. Throughout history, medical men have recognized that their patients regularly develop what we call transferences to them. The intensity and the magnitude of the relationship that the struggling young Viennese physician created with Fliess when Fliess began treating him, and thereby became his physician as well as his colleague, however, was far from one's commonplace transference. The role that he cast Fliess into, Ellenberger suggests, could be compared to a particular persona in the history of medicine, namely the religious healer, onto whom patients project, quote, the archetype of the Savior. Indeed, it is striking that the supposedly sober man of science, Freud, not only begins one letter with the salutation, "Dear magician," but in another letter he declares, "I still look to you as the Messiah." Freud recognized that Fliess's mesmerizing power paralyzed his critical capacities. Nevertheless, for a remarkably long time, the power of his dependency and need for salvation caused him to remain impervious to the mounting evidence that would have punctured his idealizations had he had his wits about him. It is inconceivable, however, that a man with Freud's formidable intellect, who lionized independence and devalued the passive feminine position, could have submitted to another man indefinitely without mounting some sort of struggle. And when the inevitable chinks began to appear in Fliess's armor, providing a toehold for Freud's doubts, doubts to fasten onto, he began an internal struggle that saw him continually oscillating between credulity and skepticism, submission and assertiveness that lasted for at least another 5 years. Freud's transference to Fliess became consolidated, as I noted, when his colleague began treating him for his acute cardiac pathology, which included violent arrhythmia, constant tension, pressure, and burning in the heart region, and shooting pains down his left arm. However, at the same time as Fliess stepped into the transferential role of the magic healer, the inconsistencies in his diagnoses produced Freud's first doubts about him. The nasal reflux neurosis was Fliess's signature theory, and it appears that he began by diagnosing Freud's condition as a case of his go-to pathology. At one point, however, Fliess seems to have changed his mind and began arguing that although nasal pathology continued to play a role, the primary etiological factor in Freud's cardiac difficulties was nicotine poisoning. His prescription followed from his diagnosis. Freud should give up his beloved cigars. And while there are many jokes about Freud and his cigars, this struggle around the cigars and giving them up was deadly serious. Deadly both in the literal sense and also in the psychological sense. It was perhaps the dread of the agony that abstinence would have produced that set Freud's critical faculties into motion. But whatever the case, the doctor cum patient began to contest the contradictions, or at least the inner tensions in Fliess's diagnosis. Thus, on 19 April 1894, he writes to Fliess, "I am especially suspicious of you because this heart affair of mine is the only one which I have ever heard you make contradictory statements." After Fliess backtracked from the nasal diagnosis and replaced it with nicotine poisoning, the struggle over Freud's smoking involved, quotes, an endless series of attempts to quit, which must have been excruciating given that he smoked approximately 20 cigars a day, became the primary arena in which the struggle over submission to his colleague cum physician was carried out. To make matters worse, in addition to Fliess's advancing contradictory diagnoses, evidence was accumulating that falsified the new diagnosis of nicotine poisoning. Thus, in the letter I have just cited, Freud also tells Fliess that despite having endured, quote, the misery of abstinence for 3 weeks, he had suffered a severe cardiac misery, greater than he had ever experienced while smoking. In other words, the symptoms not only continued, but even got worse after he stopped smoking. And on top of that, not only did the symptoms persist despite his abstinence, they also responded to digitalis. The conclusion could not be clearer. Fliess's diagnosis, identifying nicotine as the cause of Freud's cardiac pathology, was mistaken. But we are amazed when we learn from the subsequent letters that Freud continued the struggle to maintain his abstinence for some time, even after it became clear that nicotine poisoning was the wrong diagnosis. This, I would suggest, demonstrates not only the intensity of Freud's affective need to preserve Fliess as a good idealized object, but also that his wish to submit caused him to sacrifice his intellect and deny the unmistakable conclusion. Earlier, I made the claim that 2 interrelated conditions would have to be met before Freud could discover psychic reality. Theoretically, it would be necessary for him to abandon a physicalist perspective, and personally, he would have to come to terms with the fact that the nature of his illness was primarily psychological. It is significant that in the same letter of 19 April, he criticizes the contradiction in the Berliner's diagnosis. He also raises the possibility that his heart condition might be, quotes, hypochondriacal, thereby gesturing away from material reality and in the direction of psychic reality. There was, moreover, another substantial piece of denial that Freud had to engage in to preserve his idealizing transference of fleas. Not only was Fleece's numerological pseudo-mathematical theory incompatible with a psychological theory of any sort, but the Berliner also denied the validity of psychotherapy. That is, of the very practice Freud was struggling to perfect at the time. Freud attempted to deny this potentially deal-breaking conflict by maintaining that they were both engaged in a joint theoretical project in which he would provide the psychological superstructure, while Fleece, whom he referred to as the Kepler of biology, would supply the physicalist quantitative base. Urgently needing to gain some clarity, Freud turned to Breuer, a renowned diagnostician, for a consultation. After some hesitancy, which did not enhance Freud's confidence in his consultant's conclusions, Breuer eventually offered a diagnosis of chronic myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle that might have been caused by a bout of rheumatic fever Freud had suffered several years earlier. The new diagnosis, however, did not resolve things. It only, in fact, made matters worse. For it produced a complication decision tree where every possible outcome involved an unpalatable consequence. Let us begin with the assumption that the nicotine poisoning was the correct diagnosis. In this case, on the positive side, Fleece would be redeemed as a skillful diagnostician and preserved as a magical healer. The solution of the problem, namely to stop smoking, would be clear-cut, and perhaps even more significantly, the diagnosis would not be life-threatening. But in the negative column, in addition to having to endure the agony of abstinence, Freud would also have to accept Fleece's magic as a substitute for the magic of his cigars, and therefore become more heavily dependent on him. In other words, he would be forced to relinquish the relative emotional self-sufficiency that his dependable cigars, with their power to stimulate, soothe, and relieve depression, provided him. And he would be forced to rely on a fallible human being who was not under his omnipotent control to serve as the breast penis that could provide him with the energy, comfort, and psychic consolidation that he needed. The dilemma that followed from accepting, with respect to the nicotine poison. The dilemma that followed from accepting the myocarditis diagnosis is easier to see. The prognosis would be worse in that the condition was significantly more life-threatening. But Freud would not have to give up nicotine, at least not completely, which meant that he could avoid the agony of abstinence and retain the powerful pleasure and antidepressive properties and stimulative effects that his cigars afforded him. In short, by accepting this diagnosis, he would pay the price of potential morbidity, the price of potential death, in order to retain the magical potency of his beloved cigars. And along with that, he would not have to submit to Fleece, thus retaining the emotional self-sufficiency that cigars provided him. What finally led Freud to abandon the struggle sometime later and resume smoking without reservation, and thereby tacitly accept the more menacing diagnosis, despite the fact he was no stranger to Todesangst, was something he was unwilling to sacrifice to Fleece or to anyone: his creativity and capacity to work. Freud, as Dieter Anzieu observes, quotes, needed tobacco in order to concentrate his thoughts, attain a state of intellectual excitement, and combat his tendency to depression. His cigars allowed him, quotes, to be the master of his mood, without which he could not work to the fullest capacity. Next section, section 3. I know. quarter of an hour more. Yeah. Well, let me try and summarize. The next crisis came about as a result of the experience of with the patient Irma Eckstein, which Freud addresses in the dream of Irma's injection in the interpretation of dreams. And the fact of the matter was, Fliess had performed in the dream of Irma's injection, which is the centerpiece of the interpretation of dreams. Freud was trying to demonstrate the dreams were the fulfillment, disguised fulfillment of wishes. And in the dream, he claims to be trying to fulfill the wish that to exonerate himself as being responsible for the awful things that happened to his patient. When in fact, the real wish was to exonerate Fliess, whom had really not only botched the operation, which he was ill-equipped to perform, but had treated the patient in a way that, as Max Schur said, would have been actionable. I mean, it was really maltreatment of the patient. So after the experience with Emma, Freud both knew and didn't know that Fliess had been responsible for this horrible incident. And the battle with Fliess, the next major chink in his argument, was around his both trying to acknowledge the fact that Fliess had been responsible, which meant that Fliess was in some way a quack, but in his inability to admit it. Let me. Okay. Well, the H manuscript, and while he was in the series of letters, and the real background to the dream can be found in his letters to Fliess, which the Freud establishment suppressed. At least it suppressed a full unexpurgated publication of them until 1985. And when it came out, it was absolutely clear what had happened. And in the one of his letters to Fliess, he also attached theoretical drafts, which were very important and which were precursors of later theoretical developments. I mean, one of the amazing things about Freud is ideas that he developed at the end of his career are already present in Nietzsche, in the letters to Fliess, and in the project. And one of the letters contained what he called Draft H. And the central thesis in Draft H is that people become paranoid over things they cannot put up with. Or put differently, the purpose of paranoia is to ward off an idea that is incompatible with the ego by projecting it into the external world. As one can see when considering the final, moving, elegiac, and brilliant letters to Fliess, where Freud explains the breakup in terms of the Berliners' inability to put up with the homosexual dimension of their undoubted love for each other, which meant that Fliess had, because he couldn't accept the homosexual love, had to project his intolerable homosexuals and became paranoid as a result. This model of what I call the model of the amoeba, which Freud produces in Mourning and Melancholia, this idea that became a central figure of thought in Mourning and Melancholia and the ego and the id, was already there in his trying to conceptualize what was going on between him and Fliess in this letter. So the struggle went on, I go into great detail, the struggle went on a back and forth way with Fliess for quite some time, and Freud was both suffering enormously taking enormous amounts of cocaine, but also being enormously productive. And not only was he being productive in producing some of his most important early clinical papers, like the last chapter in the studies of hysteria, he was also producing some of his most important neurological papers. So it was like a manic depressive, prolonged manic depressive episode where he was profoundly depressed, taking cocaine to deal with it, but profoundly creative at the same time. But he was being creative both along the physicalist line and along the clinical line. And he realized that the two were in conflict with each other, but he kept proceeding with both at the same time because he still couldn't break with fleas. And that went on for an extended period, which I won't go into detail. And then the real break didn't take place. I'm sorry, I didn't have time to cut this down as a problem. Didn't take place until Freud's father died. And when Freud's father died, Freud went into a profound depression and started his own self-analysis. And during his self-analysis, where he started understanding his own inner world and exploring his own inner world, that was really where he began to separate from fleas. And during that period, one of the things he published was the so-called Project for Scientific Psychology, in which is he actually wrote it on the way back from started to write it on the way back from seeing fleas in Berlin, and sort of a manic attempt, one last effort to save the scientific, physicalistic side of the relationship. And as he puts it, it's an attempt to give a comprehensive account of the psyche in quantitative terms alone. He was going to give a comprehensive physicalist account of the psyche, the psychic apparatus. And when he got back to Berlin, he finished it in an excited state, but put it in the drawer. And after the excited state passed, he sunk into a depression, couldn't understand why he had written it in the first place, and he never published it. And that was the point, I would argue, where he really gave up the physicalist approach and started concentrating on the purely psychological approach. Just en passant, today's advocates of neuropsychoanalysis say, well, if that wasn't the reason why he gave up the project, but the reason he gave up the project was that the primitive neurology of his day did not allow him to complete it. And if he were alive today and he had brain imaging and everything, he would have continued along lines of being a neurologist. I think that's nonsense. I think a condition to the possibility of creating psychoanalysis was breaking with neurology, just like a condition of the possibility of creating psychoanalysis was breaking with hypnosis. So, and I'll bring this to a quick conclusion, if I can find the right place to do it. Okay, so the event that set the transition fully into motion was the death of Freud's father on 23rd October 1896. In the wake of Jacob's passing, which Freud reports reawakened the whole past, he was plunged into a state of acute mourning. He began to systematically pursue his self-analysis as a way of dealing with pain. Not only had he become, as he put it, his most important patient, he said, I too am a hysteric like my patients, but his self-analysis had become the essential thing in his life. In addition to representing a decisive step in Freud's coming to terms with the fact that he was suffering from some form of psychopathology, turning to the self-analysis also provided him with growing insight into the nature of psychic reality. It's very significant to note. I mean, Jones says he gave up cocaine much earlier. He didn't give up cocaine till his father died and he started his self-analysis. So he stopped looking for an external solution in the form of the cocaine and turned inward to try and find a solution to his suffering. In addition to representing a decisive step in Freud's coming to terms with blah, 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 one of the reasons why mourning is such a painful process, according to Freud, is that the mourner cannot escape it. And by precipitating the period of prolonged and agonizing mourning, Jacob's death forced Freud to confront the existence of his own psychic reality and, in turn, of the reality of psychic reality, as it were, in general. Besides engendering a sense of conviction about psychic reality, the work of mourning can also promote a sense of certainty about the truth of one's own personal reality. And this is what happened with Freud. As a result of his self-analysis, as his self-analysis progressed, it not only increased his confidence in his theory of dreams, of the unconscious, of the principles of mental functioning, and so on, it also progressively undermined his relationship with fleas. Over time, he came to realize that his original mode of psychological theorizing was incompatible with the Berliner's physicalist quantitative pseudoscience. And to the extent that his growing confidence in the truth and magnitude of his own discoveries led to Freud's disillusionment and de-idealization of fleas, it also led to a recognition and internalization of the significance of his own powers and achievements. He began to accept the fact that it was he and not the charismatic, hyper-speculative ENT specialist from Berlin who was the great thinker. But as one would expect, this process did not follow a straightforward trajectory, and the work of de-idealization, separation, and internalization dragged on for another several years. So the final paragraph. By 1900, however, as a result of his Trauerarbeit, of his work of mourning, his self-analysis, separation from fleas, and completion of the interpretation of dreams, Freud's creative illness terminated in a way that closely approximates Ellenberger's ideal typical phenomenon. Freud may not have become a paradigm of insanity or normality, nor would we have wanted him to become one. But as Ellenberger observes, he emerged from this ordeal with a more than negligible transformation of his personality and conviction that he had discovered truths of the spiritual world. His self-analysis, Ellenberger continues, transformed the unsure young practitioner into a self-assured founder of a new school, convinced that he had made a great discovery, which he saw as his theoretical task. Freud, in short, had taken hold as private, excruciating, and crippling illness that had tormented him for years and transformed it into a creative project with epical significance. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. La bonne nouvelle, c'est que j'ai oublié mon exposé chez moi, donc je vais le faire de mémoire. Et que ça sera sans doute plus court. L'exposé que vous venez d'entendre est la continuation d'un autre exposé qu'on mettra en ligne, etc., que Joël a fait hier, qui a pour objet de cerner une difficulté centrale de la psychanalyse. C'est que si on dit en psychanalyse que toute notre vie mentale procède de notre vie instinctive et intellectuelle, enfin des pulsions et de l'inconscient, alors il y a une difficulté épistémologique centrale, c'est comment est-ce que vous pouvez avoir une théorie objective de cette affirmation que nous avons une vie, que tout dans notre esprit procède des pulsions et de l'inconscient. Le problème, c'est que soit vous dites que vous avez une partie de vous-même, une partie de votre moi qui est libre de conflits, complètement immunisée contre la sexualisation de la pensée et que c'est cette partie qui fait le travail de l'objectivation, ou bien l'autre danger, c'est de dire qu'en fait, vous croyez faire des théories objectivantes et scientifiques et en réalité, vous n'avez que des fantasmes plus élaborés qui, en réalité, continuent d'être des fantasmes, mais ne sont pas des connaissances objectives. Alors, là, l'exposé d'hier, Joël a discuté un petit peu de la partie négative, c'est-à-dire de son argument. C'est-à-dire que si on est pris dans une sorte de conflit, ou bien comment faire en sorte que la psychanalyse puisse être à la fois une théorie qui affirme que tout vient de l'inconscient et donc tout a des fondements pulsionnels, naturels, conflictuels, etc. Et en même temps affirmer la thèse d'une production interne à la psychanalyse, d'un point de vue, d'une possibilité de tenir un discours sur les fantasmes qui ne soit pas lui-même un fantasme, où cette théorie ne serait pas elle-même un fantasme de théorie. Et le concept que Joël mobilise pour arriver à faire cette distinction, c'est celui de sublimation. Il doit y avoir un processus psychique interne qui nous permet de produire un espace dans lequel nous pouvons porter un jugement objectif sur ce qui se passe, nous pouvons produire de la science, même si cette science a ultimement ou cette connaissance rationnelle a ultimement pour fondement notre vie pulsionnelle. Alors, l'argument d'hier était un argument qui montrait un peu ce dilemme. Celui d'aujourd'hui fournit une sorte de preuve positive, c'est-à-dire comment est-ce qu'en prenant la vie même de Freud et l'invention de la psychanalyse, on peut reconstituer un processus sublimatoire qui permet de montrer comment, à partir des conflits, des pulsions et des drames de la vie psychique de Freud, il n'en ressort pas moins la possibilité de constituer un savoir objectif, un savoir rationnel, un savoir conscient, un savoir sur ces processus qui ne soit pas un savoir qui lui-même est un de ces processus. Alors, la difficulté de l'exposé de Joël ce matin, vous l'avez remarqué, c'est qu'elle met en tension trois choses que nous connaissons bien. Elle met en tension une réactualisation de l'idée très classique de maladie créative de Berger, plus une relecture de ce classique de la psychanalyse française, parce que Joël est un bon connaisseur, il a lu toutes les traductions de ces analystes français, de l'auto-analyse d'Anzieu. Mais dans sa relecture de l'auto-analyse d'Anzieu, vous avez remarqué, ce que Anzieu attribue au processus de deuil est ici attribué au processus de sublimation. C'est ça le premier décalage qui, je crois, est très remarquable. Et que la troisième chose, c'est que Joël mobilise une version post-cohoutienne du transfert idéalisant, qui est une version soit du transfert en miroir, soit du transfert jumeau, du twin sheet transference, mais en tout cas, un concept du transfert qui implique une théorie du narcissisme extrêmement différente de celle de Freud. Je rappelle que chez Cohout, il n'y a pas de pulsion. C'est pas un des trucs fondamentaux. Dans la théorie de la relation d'objets cohoutienne, les pulsions sont complètement écartées. Alors, quand vous prenez la biographie de Freud que nous avons publiée, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Vous avez une manière dans le travail de Joel Whitebook de prendre ensemble ce qu'il appelle l'homosexualité réprimée de Freud, que Freud appelle lui-même ses tendances androphiles, et qui procède donc du déni constant dans Freud de la passivité et de la féminité, qui est lié à son rapport à sa mère, et d'articuler tout cela à une manière particulière de déformer et de subir des tensions psychiques extrêmes dans ses rapports avec les autres hommes. Ce qui se passe avec Fliss se répétera sous une autre forme, à mon avis, avec Jung. C'est ça le point clé de l'argument, et dans la biographie, ça joue un rôle absolument déterminant dans l'argument de Freud. Et c'est pour ça, au fond, vous arrivez à cette idée, dans la lettre à Ferenczi 1910, que j'ai réussi là où le paranoïaque échoue. C'est vraiment, pour lui, l'opération, la vraie réussite, qui n'est pas simplement subjective, mais qui est scientifique, c'est de réussir là où le paranoïaque échoue. dans la mesure où la paranoïa, je le rappelle, est une caricature de la science, de la même manière que la névrose obsessionnelle est une caricature de la religion, et que l'hystérie est une caricature de l'art. Alors, maintenant, le problème, c'est de savoir si la notion de sublimation que mobilise Joël fait le boulot. Pour ça, je voudrais rappeler un certain nombre de choses. Le problème, c'est que dans la métapsychologie, parmi les manuscrits perdus de la métapsychologie, vous avez le manuscrit sur la sublimation. Donc, on ne sait pas ce que Freud a dit, ni même si Freud a jugé digne de conserver ce manuscrit, s'il est perdu parce qu'il l'a jeté ou s'il est perdu parce qu'il est simplement égaré. Maintenant, si on essaie de rassembler les petits éléments que Freud nous donne sur la sublimation, qu'est-ce qu'on a? Dans la première version de la sublimation est une modification du but de la pulsion par désexualisation, dont le résultat est souvent, mais pas toujours, souvent que l'objet acquiert une qualité sociale, comme par exemple quand il devient une œuvre d'art. Point important, la sublimation ne procure pas autant de satisfaction que la décharge brute de la pulsion. En tout cas, il y a quelque chose qui va rester tout du long dans le concept freudien de sublimation, c'est qu'elle est instable. Elle est fragile, hein. C'est très difficile de se maintenir dans cette posture, et de toute façon, elle est partielle. Et elle entretient des relations qui sont cliniquement extrêmement difficiles à distinguer avec les formations de réactions, voire avec la production perverse d'objets. C'est très facile de voir que tout fétiche, par exemple, comporte une certaine dimension sublimatoire. Maintenant, quand il introduit pour de bon, après 14, le concept de narcissisme, alors le concept de sublimation subit une transformation remarquable. Il devient une manière de satisfaire le moi sans déclencher de refoulement. Toutefois, il reste bien, dans ces textes-là, une matière de pulsion. C'est une matière de pulsion, et Freud fait très clairement la distinction entre la sublimation qui relève d'une modification du but pulsionnel et l'idéalisation par surévaluation de l'objet. D'où le problème dans l'argument de Joël, c'est que le deuil fonctionne par surévaluation de l'objet. Il y a une phase de surévaluation de l'objet. Est-ce que cette phase de surévaluation de l'objet est la même chose que la simple déviation par désexualisation du but de la pulsion? Ce qu'on pourrait imaginer, et c'est une perspective que je n'avais jamais imaginée, c'est que les capacités à la sublimation puissent avoir les mêmes sources que les capacités au deuil. Mais ça ne veut pas dire pour autant que la sublimation et l'idéalisation fonctionnent de la même manière. Après 1924 et le fameux article sur la dissolution du complexe d'Oedipe, la sublimation prend encore un nouveau tour. Au départ, la sublimation, dans les textes de la période du narcissisme, c'est une manière de trouver une façon de rendre compatible la libido du moi et la libido d'objet. Juste compatible. Après 1924, au moment de la théorie de la résolution du complexe d'Oedipe, Freud modifie cette théorie. C'est plus juste une question de compatibilité. C'est que toute sublimation implique la transformation d'une libido d'objet en libido narcissique. Parce que l'identification implique la désexualisation. Et à ce moment-là, une nouvelle perspective apparaît, qui est très importante pour les cliniciens, c'est que là où il y a sublimation et désexualisation de l'objet, il va y avoir libération de l'agressivité. Ce qui est la raison pour laquelle, quand bien même on pousserait les gens, n'est-ce pas, on recommandait, je ne sais pas si ça se fait toujours, enfin moi on me recommandait de ne jamais inciter qui que ce soit à sublimer. Parce que très très bien, les gens vont se mettre à écrire, ils vont se mettre à faire de la peinture, et puis ils vont se mettre à voir comme des trous, et voir à s'enfoncer. Ça déchaîne, ça déchaîne la pulsion de mort, la sublimation, en désexualisant. Et donc, on ne sait jamais quels peuvent être les résultats d'inciter qui que ce soit à sublimer. Quand bien même on pourrait inciter quelqu'un à sublimer, ce qui est quelque chose de tout à fait problématique. Donc ma première question, pour Joël, c'était, quand on rappelle un petit peu tous ces concepts classiques, hein, toutes ces notions classiques de Freud sur la sublimation, on s'aperçoit qu'elles sont difficilement compatibles avec les postulats théoriques qui sont les siens, qui viennent de la théorie de la relation d'objet et qui viennent d'une théorie antipulsionnelle du narcissisme qui est celle de Goethe. Comment est-ce que tout cela tient ensemble? Est-ce que c'est, vous voyez, suffisamment cohérent pour pouvoir réaliser le geste psychanalytique crucial qui est de corriger ou de compléter la théorie du deuil par la théorie de la sublimation dans l'invention de la psychanalyse? Et au fond, est-ce qu'on n'est pas, ça ne met pas sous les yeux le fait que les théories de la relation d'objet, à la différence des théories freudiennes classiques, n'ont pas de concept, elles non plus, de concept clair de sublimation. Elles ne fournissent pas un concept clair de sublimation. Alors, la deuxième chose que je voulais préciser, c'est la chose suivante. C'est que, d'habitude, on pense à la sublimation dans le registre de l'œuvre d'art. Une originalité essentielle du travail de Joël, c'est dire que ce n'est pas seulement l'œuvre d'art, c'est l'œuvre de science. C'est l'activité créatrice, philosophique, rationnelle, de production d'une connaissance qui a une valeur sociale, et que l'objet qui est produit par la sublimation va être ici, par exemple, la théorie psychanalytique. Pas l'expérience des fantasmes, mais une théorie sur les fantasmes. Alors, où est-ce que Freud parle de la sublimation en ce sens-là? Il en parle quand il discute de la pulsion de savoir, du Wissentrieb. C'est-à-dire, le Wissentrieb, la pulsion de savoir, la pulsion de connaissance, est elle-même une forme sublimée de la pulsion d'emprise, de la Bemächtigungstrieb. Et cette pulsion d'emprise est, en général, combine quelque chose comme la pulsion sexuelle, se combine à la pulsion sexuelle, elle est désexualisée, cette pulsion d'emprise, et elle se combine à la pulsion sexuelle pour contrôler et maîtriser l'objet sexuel. Autrement dit, c'est un emboîtement, pour arriver à la Wissentrieb, un emboîtement de poupées russes, n'est-ce pas, avec la pulsion de savoir, la pulsion d'emprise et le recours à la pulsion scopique. Un des intérêts fondamentaux de cette conception de la pulsion de savoir, c'est de dénaturaliser radicalement le fait de réussir à faire de la théorie ou à obtenir des concepts clairs. La métaphysique d'Aristote, à la première phrase de la métaphysique d'Aristote, pates anthropoi et denai rebundae fusei, c'est que tous les hommes désirent savoir, fusei, par nature. Freud est aux antipodes. Le savoir, le désir de savoir, n'est vraiment absolument pas du tout par nature. C'est le résultat extrêmement complexe d'un emboîtement de sublimation, de rapport au contrôle de l'objet, de la vision scopique, etc., qui fait qu'il n'a rien de naturel au sens d'évident, d'universellement distribué, etc. Mais c'est peut-être aussi pour ça qu'il y a un problème, c'est que la notion de sublimation ne sert pas à fabriquer de la science. Elle sert plutôt à rappeler de manière critique et négative l'origine sordide de nos concepts scientifiques. C'est pour ça que je rappelais tout à l'heure que la sublimation, c'est pas parce que la religion et la névrose obsessionnelle est la caricature de la religion, ou que la paranoïa est la caricature de l'esprit scientifique, qu'on pourrait considérer que la sublimation de la névrose obsessionnelle pourrait produire de la vraie religion, ou la sublimation de la paranoïa, pourrait, si le mot même a même un sens, pourrait produire de la science. C'est plutôt quelque chose de négatif qui permet non pas de produire de la science ou de produire de la théorie, mais de rappeler les humbles origines sordides des concepts qui sont les plus transparents. Et de la même manière que, dit Platon, la philosophie est la fille d'Iris et Thomas, de la vue et de l'admiration, on pourrait dire du coup que la psychanalyse est la fille de Iris et Friquet, c'est-à-dire de la vue et de l'horreur. C'est pour ça qu'au fond, ce que je crois que Joël établit, ça n'est pas tellement que dans son travail sur Freud, ce n'est pas tellement que la psychanalyse est le fruit de la sublimation de Freud, mais c'est que la psychanalyse a quelque chose d'un savoir sublime. C'est un savoir sublime parce qu'il est un savoir qui réussit à nous fournir les moyens de penser ce qui nous fait le plus horreur. Les origines sexuelles les plus épouvantables, les organes génitaux féminins comme médusants et comme source de l'existence de chacun des sujets de la connaissance et des individus libres des sociétés modernes, et de la jouissance sexuelle comme promesse de la mort. Et en ce sens, je crois que c'est très important parce que ça ne veut pas du tout dire que je ne suis pas en désaccord complet avec ce que dit Joël, mais je pense que si on prend le sublime de la psychanalyse au sens fort, c'est-à-dire comme le produit d'une activité sublimatoire, alors je pense que ça nous rattache à l'expérience du sublime tel que Kant et Goethe le présentaient. C'est-à-dire que ça nous donne une idée de ce que la psychanalyse fait, au sens où elle nous donne accès à la grandeur, à quelque chose que j'appellerais la grandeur épistémique. Et cette epistemic greatness, sur laquelle je termine ma réponse à Joël, est peut-être au fond la seule qui nous est laissée dans un univers égalitaire et démocratique. Elle ne consiste pas en autre chose que de pouvoir mobiliser la science et la rationalité pour regarder dans les yeux ce qu'il y a de plus terrible. Et que c'est, au fond, même la rationalité et la science la plus ordinaire, l'exigence de la preuve, l'exigence du fondement, etc., mais qui, au lieu d'être tournée vers des objets neutres, est tournée vers les objets les plus angoissants. Et que vous reconnaissez là le sens kantien et goethéen du sublime, qui est tout simplement que c'est de regarder le spectacle terrifiant et infini de la nature, les chutes d'eau, du Niagara, voilà, des choses comme ça, mais dans un lieu où vous êtes profondément en sécurité. Et ainsi de ressentir l'expérience morale de voir l'infini se présenter dans le sensible, voir l'infini, c'est là, tout en étant à l'abri de sa terrifiante puissance. La psychanalyse, en relevant de façon extrêmement forte de la rationalité et de la science, crée un abri à l'intérieur du langage, de la pensée rationnelle, etc., d'où nous pouvons contempler les puissances les plus terrifiantes et les plus angoissantes de la nature. Et que le savoir psychanalytique, l'expérience psychanalytique, introduit ainsi chacun des êtres humains à quelque chose comme une expérience de la grandeur dans le savoir, dans le fait que ce savoir peut désormais se tourner vers les choses les plus terribles. J'ai traduit en anglais tout ceci pour Joël, et on va peut-être le laisser réagir.
First of all, I'd like to thank Pierre-Henri for those comments, which I have a summary of. But I'd also like to add something. I mean, this is the culmination of 3 days of discussion, and the fact that both of us are trained as philosophers and psychoanalysts means, I think, that we share a certain project, which namely is to understand how the two disciplines interpenetrate each other and to try and use the two to mutually elucidate each other. And as a result, his comments over the past 3 days, I think, have really, he's demonstrated a real insight into my project and what I'm trying to get at, and I want to thank him for that.
Alors, je traduis rapidement parce que ce sont des compliments. Voilà, comme on a tous les deux une formation philosophique et analytique, on a pu effectivement connecter les deux dans cette discussion, et il m'en remercie.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'm just going to comment on a few of what I take to be the essential points of what he said. And I'll begin by making two terminological points.
Alors, 2 points terminologiques pour clarifier les choses.
And I don't think they're trivial. I think they actually lead to the important questions he raised. The first one, he says that in the concept of sublimation, part of our psychic energy is desexualized. Well, I object to the term desexualized, which was actually used by the Hartman ego psychologists, a school which both of us are rather hostile towards.
Bon, donc il n'est pas d'accord avec l'idée que l'énergie psychique est désexualisée, parce que pour lui, ça, c'est une interprétation hartmannienne de Freud, et il n'est pas d'accord avec cette lecture.
In fact, Edith Jacobson, who was one of the best members of that school, went so far as to say, to be creative, your instinctual life had to be neutralized. And if it became re-instinctualized, that would disrupt your creativity. Well,
alors, Edith Jacobson, qui est une représentante éminente de ce courant hartmannien, allait même jusqu'à dire que pour être créatif, il fallait que votre énergie soit vraiment désexualisée complètement.
I mean, how can we think of instances of great creativity that were de-instinctualized as she's describing? Think of Picasso. Picasso without the instincts would not be Picasso. Beethoven without the instincts would not be Beethoven.
Bon, donc c'est absurde dans la mesure où il est assez facile de trouver des exemples comme Picasso ou Beethoven, où justement c'était absolument manifeste que c'est extrêmement sexualisé, que le processus de création est extrêmement sexualisé et non pas dépulsionnalisé.
So I would prefer to say something like that the instincts are metamorphosized. And one advantage to the English translation of Freud's notion of Aufhebung, which is, of course, so important, central for Hegel, he wouldn't be Hegel without it, is it's translated as sublated or sublate. It's a horrible term, but you see the connection between sublimation and sublimation and sublation there, between Aufhebung and sublimation. And the important point for the notion of Aufhebung is that the material is both negated and lifted up and transformed, metamorphosized through negation and preservation.
Alors, donc, dans l'intérêt de la traduction anglaise de Freud, c'est que lorsqu'il rencontre le terme hegelien de Aufhebung, c'est-à-dire de dépassement dialectique, dans la traduction contemporaine on dit surjonction, c'est traduit par le mot par sublate ou sublimé, qui se rattache assez facilement en anglais, se rapproche en tout cas du terme sublimé. Ça veut dire, comme dans la Aufhebung hegelienne, c'est quelque chose qui est élevé et transformé. Et donc là où il y avait désexualisation, il préfère parler, lui, de métamorphose. C'est le déplacement qui est opéré, où c'est conservé, soulevé et sublimé.
Negated and conserved.
Pardon?
Negated and conserved.
Et c'est à la fois nié et conservé. Je rappelle que Aufhebung, c'est la consigne à bagages dans les gares allemandes. Vous déposez vos trucs, vous les enlevez, etc. Bon. Donc c'est un mot tout à fait banal qui prend chez Hegel une fonction comme ça totalement transcendante. C'est à la fois nié, conservé et transformé en quelque chose de supérieur.
The other formulation that I would like to comment on, Pierre-Henri said, the radical thesis is that psychoanalysis cannot be anything else but a byproduct of Freud's own sublimatory processes. I just want to modify that a little bit for a very particular reason. I would say, I would formulate it like this instead. It could not have began as anything but a byproduct of Freud's sublimatory processes. Because the way I would put it, Freud's sublimatory processes achieved enough, went far enough, where they in fact illuminated the processes of psychic reality and sublimation, so that we could create a good enough foundation so that we could carry on his work. The reason I want to say that is because a lot of the Freud bashers say, well, Freud's self-analysis and the interpretation of dreams are the foundational act of psychoanalysis, and to the extent that there are difficulties with them, the whole process is negated.
Donc il y a une modification, il veut corriger ce que j'ai dit quand je décris son travail comme tournant autour de la thèse que la psychanalyse serait le produit de la sublimation, un byproduct en anglais, une sorte de sous-produit de la sublimation freudienne. En fait, il précise, c'est comme ça que ça a commencé. Et c'est très important parce que ça a commencé, ça permet d'établir le concept de réalité psychique et de permettre d'avoir une idée de la réalité psychique, mais ensuite il y a d'autres choses qui se passent. Et pourquoi insiste-t-il là-dessus? Parce que les adversaires de Freud, au moment des Freud Wars, des guerres freudiennes des années 90, les Freud bashers, partaient de l'idée que puisque tout ici est entièrement falsifié, déformé d'une manière absolument inadmissible, etc., alors tout le reste de la psychanalyse, qui repose sur ce fondement, ne vaut rien, à cause de ces origines qui reposent sur des trucs complètement fous, des mensonges, des exagérations, etc. Donc ça lui importe de dire que c'est un commencement, mais c'est un commencement qui est une source positive pour la suite.
Another point that Pierre-Henri has made, that I use the concept of sublimation as opposed to Angier, who uses the process of mourning. Well, I think the two processes go together, and this, in fact, actually can be traced back to draft H, where he has this model of paranoia and projection internalization, which then reappears in mourning and melancholia, and then reappears in the ego and the id, and where he discusses the project of ego formation, the process of mourning that he describes in Mourning and Melancholia as a pathological process. Later, 1923, he says it isn't just a pathological process. In fact, this model of internalization is the model for ego formation as such. So the internalization of the object and the transformation of the ego through it, which he described earlier in Mourning and Melancholia, now becomes the universal method for ego development and the sublimatory process.
Donc là, ensuite, il répond à la remarque que je fais sur le problème de l'articulation de la sublimation et du deuil. Il maintient donc que ces deux vont ensemble et que la chose était déjà extrêmement présente dans le manuscrit H des lettres à Fliss, et qu'il pense qu'il y a donc une continuité forte entre le manuscrit H, deuil et mélancolie, et notamment l'évolution de Freud après deuil et mélancolie, où l'introjection, c'est pas le mot qu'il emploie, mais c'est pour qu'on voit de quoi il parle, où l'introjection du moi, l'introjection de l'objet dans le moi est d'abord considérée comme essentiellement pathologique et source donc de la maladie mélancolique. Mais ensuite, après, il s'aperçoit que c'est pas du tout pathologique, c'est le principe même de la constitution du moi, et donc ça devient un processus universel. Et tout au long de cette transformation, évolution de l'œuvre de Freud, sublimation et deuil vont ensemble.
My next comment connects 2 points. One is that one of the reasons why there has been such skepticism or such difficulty in conceptualizing sublimation in the psychoanalytic tradition is because it is generally taken to be a defense. That's one point. And the other point is that Pierre-Henri said, I have a post-Freudian, a post-classical position in trying to understand it, and he described it as a relational position. The reason I want to make a correction here is because the relational refers to a specific school in the United States, which I'm very opposed to, and which, it's not as big a problem here, but a lot of my theoretical political work in the States is against it. So I would say object relations school rather than relational. It may seem picayune, but to an American, it's an important point. And with respect to the object relation school, the two people with respect to the object relation school, the two people I draw on most for trying to reconceptualize the theory of sublimation are Hans Lowald and D.W. Winnicott. And several points have to be made here. First, all of the philosophical commentators on Freud, Paul Ricoeur, who understands library, is here, Marcuse, Winnicott, Lowald, all point to the fact that a fundamental problem with his theoretical construction that in fact leads to his anthropological pessimism is his limited concept of pleasure. And that if we really want to get at foundational problems, we have to reconceptualize pleasure. And if you recall...
Alors, bien, la raison principale pour laquelle la sublimation n'a jamais vraiment décollé dans la théorisation, n'a jamais inspiré tant de confiance, c'est parce qu'en fait, elle est classiquement considérée comme une défense. Et que c'est ça, c'est de cette idée que la sublimation serait fondamentalement une défense que Joël veut se distancer. Il corrige d'autre part une ambiguïté, c'est que quand on parle de l'école relationnelle, c'est tout à fait ses ennemis. Hein. C'est vraiment pas du tout aux États-Unis, il est vraiment tout à fait opposé à ce qu'on appelle l'école relationnelle, et qu'il faut bien entendre quand on parle de relationnel, c'est la théorie de la relation d'objet, et non l'école relationnelle qui est l'objet, c'est sur quoi il s'appuie. Donc avec Hans Lowald et Winnicott. Et que pour lui, l'entrée qui nous permet de sortir de la métapsychologie freudienne classique et donc du discrédit apporté sur la sublimation qui ne serait que de la défense, c'est qu'il faut réélaborer le problème du plaisir. Et que c'est seulement à partir de Winnicott qu'on a eu un autre concept du plaisir. Et c'est à partir de cet autre concept du plaisir qu'il faudrait reconstruire un nouveau sens non défensif de la sublimation.
And we can actually point to the precise text where Freud's concept of pleasure leads to his anthropological pessimism. Namely, in Civilizations and Its Discontents, he says that human happiness doesn't seem to be in the plan of the universe. The pleasure principle is opposed to the overall rationality of the universe.
C'est dans le pessimisme de Freud est extrêmement manifeste et lié à son concept de plaisir et manifeste au début du malaise dans la culture, du malaise dans la civilisation, lorsqu'il explique que manifestement le plaisir ne fait pas partie de l'ordre du cosmos, de l'ordre du monde.
And his precise argument is because if we conceive of pleasure as the rapid discharge of energy,
si on pense le plaisir comme un effet de la décharge brutale de l'énergie,
it can only be an episodic event and cannot be transformed into happiness or flourishing or whatever you want to refer to it.
Alors on a des épisodes de décharge agréables, mais on ne peut pas avoir quelque chose comme un véritable bonheur.
So one of the people who challenges this most effectively is Winnicott, who says there must be two kinds of pleasure. He doesn't reject Freud's discharge pleasure, but in addition to it, there must be something like ego pleasures.
Mais comme l'indique Winnicott, qui a construit là-dessus sa conception, il faut arriver à avoir un concept de moi-plaisir qui soit irréductible à simplement ces décharges pulsionnelles.
And in Winnicott, Lowald's monograph on sublimation, which to my mind is the most, he went further than anybody else in trying to address the topic. The first couple chapters where he elucidates the problem are fantastic. Unfortunately, he was quite old at the time and never really finished it, so it trails off. But he...
Donc en fait, c'est dans l'essai sur la sublimation de Lowald, que je compte traduire en Ithaque, que dans les années à venir, que sont posées donc ces considérations sur lesquelles Joël s'appuie.
So in the first couple chapters, he makes a distinction between two kinds of pleasure, which are related to two conceptions of the fate of the drives. There is the fate of the drives, which are the conception of the drive, the fate of the drives, which comes from Freud's discharge model of the psyche, that the drives have to be repressed, defended against. And the problem is most of the previous attempts to come up with a theory of sublimation have assumed this conception of what the fate of the drives had to be. But he says, Lowell argues, in addition to this idea that the drives have to be dammed up, there's another one in which they have to be canalized or channeled. And that canalizing or channeling, he connects to a different conception of pleasure rather than discharge pleasure.
Donc, dans le texte sur la sublimation, qui est inachevé, puisque Louval n'a pas pu le terminer, c'est un de ses derniers textes, il était très âgé, il distingue deux destins des pulsions chez Freud. Donc, il y a celui qui est le plus connu, qui est celui du Freud officiel, comme souvent dit Louval, où c'est l'idée de la décharge pulsionnelle qui implique donc défense et refoulement. Et puis, il y a une autre version qui est celle du Freud unofficial, dans la terminologie de Louval, qui est présent, mais qui est beaucoup moins mis en avant, où les pulsions sont canalisées.
Okay, here's my final point. And this canalization moves in the same direction as what I suggested with the term metamorphosis. But he also makes another related distinction between two types of mastery. Mastery is domination, what Castoriadis called a power grab by the ego, which Freud advocates when he says to Einstein that we need a dictatorship of reason, or he talks about draining the Sider's A. But he talks about another concept of mastery, as opposed to mastery as domination. Mastery is coming to terms with, or mastery is coming to grips with. And this means mastery is coming to terms with the drives, the instincts, and coming to terms with means rechanneling them, synthesizing them, and integrating them. Aufgehoben. I'm sorry.
Okay. Donc, il y a, outre cette double distinction, il y a une double distinction qui vient de la distinction donc, précédente sur le destin des pulsions. Il distingue deux types de domination. La domination du Freud officiel, celle de, comme dans la correspondance avec Einstein, où ce qu'il nous faut, c'est une dictature de la raison, ou bien ce qui sous-tend l'idée de l'assèchement du gazé. Et puis, il y a une deuxième forme de domination qui est présente chez Freud, mais qui est en quelque sorte celle du Freud moins officiel, qui consiste à en venir aux prises avec l'objet, à le synthétiser et à l'intégrer, et où la maîtrise n'est pas une domination, mais une appropriation maîtrisée, en quelque sorte, qui n'a rien à voir avec la première de ces deux formes de domination. Et c'est la combinaison donc des deux qui introduit un espace à l'intérieur duquel donc la sublimation et le rapport au plaisir pourraient prendre une autre forme que celle qui est traditionnellement rapportée à l'économie archéologienne des choses.
C'est tout.
Et là, nous allons faire une pause et je vous invite donc à aller regarder la table de Yannick et nous allons reprendre ensuite avec des autres exposés. On prendra un temps pour des questions aussi. On pourrait venir de la salle.